The summer Mary Callahan turned 11. The sky over Marshall County turned the color of old brass and stayed that way for 91 days. The old-timers said they'd never seen a July like it. The corn stood shorter than a man's belt. The tobacco leaves curled at the edges, dry as parchment. Along the fence lines, black-eyed Susans that should have been knee-high by the 4th of July looked stunted, brown-tipped, like something a child had forgotten to water. Every farmer in the county walked his fields with the same slow, deliberate step, the kind of walk a man walks when he's counting things he cannot afford to lose. Mary Callahan was small for 11, thin-boned, freckled across the bridge of her nose. Her hair was the color of dry hay, and she wore it in a single braid that hung down her back, the tail of it usually catching on the strap of her denim overalls. She had eyes the color of pond water in shade of green, so quiet you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. Most folks didn't pay attention. Most folks looked right past her. That was fine with Merrick. She was pedaling her bicycle down the old sharp road at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and behind her, hitched to the frame with a length of baling wire her father had given her, without asking why, was a wooden trailer. Her father, Silas Callahan, had built the trailer for her 3 summers ago when she was 8, and had asked him for one so she could haul her chickens' feed from the barn to the coop. It had never been meant for what she was using it for now. The trailer was full of rusted aluminum irrigation pipe. Some of the sections were 6 feet long, some were 10. A few had elbow joints still attached orange with corrosion, the threads eaten down to nothing. There was a length of PVC in there too, bowed from a decade of sitting in the sun. And underneath all of it, wrapped in an old feed sack, was a coil of black polyethylene tubing she had found behind Delmer Prewitt's barn, half buried in Johnson grass. Forgotten so long, the grass had grown up through the coil like a green thread through the eye of a needle. Merrick pedaled slow. The trailer was heavy. The chain on her bicycle clicked with every rotation, a sound like a slow clock. She kept her eyes on the ditch beside the road, watching the way the runoff from 3 nights ago had cut a small channel through the red clay. She watched where the water had gone. She watched where it had stopped. She had been watching water for 2 months now. Ahead of her, on the porch of a small white farmhouse with a rusted tin roof, 3 men stood drinking coffee out of chipped mugs. One of them was Ollis Trumbo, who ran a dairy operation on the far side of the county. The second was his brother-in-law, whose name Mary could never remember. The third was a broad-shouldered man in a stained ball cap named Buford Halsey, who owned more acreage than anyone else in Marshall County, and who never let anyone forget it. They watched her ride past. They didn't wave. Buford Halsey took a long sip of his coffee. He tipped his cap back on his head with one thick knuckle. He watched the girl and the trailer until they were nearly to the bend in the road, and then he turned to Ollis Trumbo, and he said loud enough that the words carried on the still morning air. "Well, Ollis, there goes Silas Callahan's little girl, off to save the world with a wagon full of scrap." Ollis Trumbo laughed. Not cruelly, just the way a man laughs when he doesn't understand something and doesn't feel the need to. His brother-in-law laughed too. Merrick did not turn her head. She kept pedaling, but her hands, small on the handlebars, tightened until the tips of her fingers went white. The Callahan farm sat at the end of a gravel road 3 miles south of the town of Benton, on 87 acres of river bottom that had been in the family since 1888. Silas Callahan was the 4th generation to work that ground. His father had worked it before him, and his grandfather before that, and his great-grandfather, a red-haired Irishman named Padraig Callahan, had cleared the first 10 acres with an axe and a mule, and a wife who had died in childbirth the second winter. Silas was 42 years old. He was tall, thin, sun-darkened, and quiet. The way certain men are quiet not from shyness, but from a lifelong habit of finding words insufficient. He wore a wedding ring worn thin from 20 years of work. He drank his coffee black. He said grace before every meal, even when there wasn't much on the table to be grateful for. That summer, there wasn't much. The bank in Paducah had sent him a letter in April, then another one in May, then a third in June, this one on heavier paper, with a signature at the bottom instead of a stamp. Silas kept all 3 letters in the top drawer of the roll-top desk in the parlor. He hadn't shown them to his wife. He hadn't shown them to his mother. He hadn't shown them to anyone. But Merrick knew. Merrick had known since the second letter came. She had been the one who walked to the mailbox that day, and she had seen the return address. And she had stood at the end of the driveway for a long time before she carried the envelope up to the house. She hadn't opened it. She hadn't needed to. She knew what a bank letter looked like. She was 11, not stupid. That night, she had lain awake in the room she shared with her little sister Delphine, and she had listened through the thin wall as her father and mother talked in the kitchen. She hadn't heard the words. She hadn't needed to. She had heard the sound of her mother's voice going soft and then softer, and she had heard the long silence that followed. And she had heard very late the sound of her father pushing back his chair and walking out onto the porch alone. She had heard him standing out there in the dark for a long time. She had heard him not coming back inside. The next morning before the sun came up, Merrick had put on her overalls and her boots, and she had walked out into the north pasture. And she had stood at the top of the slope and looked down at the 12 acres of struggling soybeans in the low field. And she had begun for the first time in her young life to think about water, not as something that fell from the sky, but as something a person could move. The Callahan house was a 2-story white clapboard with a wraparound porch and a swing on the east side that Silas's grandfather had hung there in 1954. The kitchen was the heart of it. That was where the family gathered for meals, for coffee, for the long, slow talk that came after supper, when the dishes were done and the light through the window turned honey-colored. It was where Merrick's mother, Marlene, kept her cast-iron skillets hanging on hooks above the stove, and where her grandmother, Etta, sat every morning at the round oak table with a chipped white mug of black coffee and a stack of yellowed pamphlets she'd been collecting since before Merrick was born. Etta Callahan was 82 years old. She was small, smaller than Merrick, almost with white hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked like it had been sculpted rather than combed. Her hands were knotted from arthritis. Her eyes were the same pond water green as her granddaughter's and just as quiet. She had lived in the small back bedroom of the farmhouse for 29 years, ever since her husband Cyrus had died of a stroke in the barn on a cold morning in November of 1994. She had raised 3 children in that house. She had buried a husband from that house. She had watched her only son Silas take over the farm from that house. And every morning of those 29 years, without fail, she had come to the kitchen at 5:30 with her black coffee and her pamphlets. And she had read. The pamphlets came from the county extension office, most of them. Some were older. Some were from the Department of Agriculture, dating back to the 1950s. A few were from the University of Kentucky, printed in the 1960s and 1970s, on thin newsprint that had gone yellow at the edges. Etta kept them in a wooden crate under her bed, organized by year. And she read them the way other women her age read novels, slowly, with attention, and with a small pencil in her hand for underlining. No one in the family had ever asked her why. No one had ever asked her what she was looking for. Merrick was the first. It was the morning after Merrick brought home her 3rd trailer load of pipe. She had stacked the pipes behind the chicken coop out of sight from the house, and she had come inside for breakfast, and she had found her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table alone. Marlene was already out in the garden. Silas was in the barn with a broken tractor part. Rennick, her older brother, was still asleep upstairs. Delphine was on the porch feeding scraps to the cat. Etta looked up from her pamphlet when Merrick came in. She did not say hello. She said very quietly, "You've been collecting pipe." Merrick froze in the doorway. Etta did not look angry. She did not look surprised. She looked, in fact, exactly the way she looked every morning. Patient, small, quiet, her hands wrapped around the chipped white mug. Merrick had not told anyone. Not her father. Not her mother. Not Delphine, who followed her everywhere. Not Rennick, who would have laughed. She had gone out on her bicycle for 4 Saturdays running, and she had knocked on doors, and she had asked farmers for their old pipes, and she had hauled them home in her trailer and stacked them behind the coop, and she had not said a single word to anyone in the house about why. And her grandmother, who spent every morning at the kitchen table with a pamphlet, had known. Etta set down her mug. She reached into the pocket of her house coat and she pulled out something small and folded. A piece of paper softened at the creases from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. She laid it on the table between them. "Come here, child," she said. Mary came. She sat down across from her grandmother, and she watched as Etta unfolded the paper with hands that trembled just slightly from the arthritis. It was a drawing, pencil or notebook paper gone yellow with age. The lines were fine and careful and had been drawn by someone who understood what they were drawing. It showed a hillside and a small pond at the top, and a network of pipes running down the slope with tiny arrows indicating the direction of water flow, and neat little numbers at each junction indicating pipe diameter and elevation change. It was a gravity-fed drip irrigation system. The design was 55 years old. Mary could tell from the paper alone. She looked up at her grandmother. Etta was watching her with those quiet green eyes. "I drew that," Etta said, "in the summer of 1968. I was 27 years old. I had a baby on my hip and another one on the way. And I had spent 3 years reading every pamphlet the extension office would give me because I had grown up on a farm in Trigg County that lost half its crop to drought every 3rd year. And I had made up my mind that when I married a farmer, I would find a way to keep that from happening to my children." Merrick did not speak. Etta went on. "I took this drawing to the extension office in Benton in September of 1968. I asked them to look at it. I asked them if they would help me build it on your grandfather's farm. There were 4 men in that office. 2 of them were agricultural engineers. 1 of them was the county agent. The 4th was a man from the state." She paused, her hands folded on the table. "They laughed at me, child. Every one of them. They said a woman didn't understand pipe pressure. They said a woman shouldn't be reading pamphlets she couldn't comprehend. They said I should go home and mind my babies." She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside a rooster crowed. A single thin sound. "I went home," Etta said. "I put the drawing in my Bible. I never showed it to another living soul. Not to your grandfather. Not to your father. Not to anyone. For 55 years, that drawing has sat in my Bible." She looked at Merrick. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. "I saw you bring the first trailer load home," she said, 4 Saturdays ago. "I saw you stack the pipes behind the coop. I saw you go out into the north pasture with a notebook. I have watched you, child. I have watched the way you watch the water." She reached across the table. She took Merrick's small hand in her own knotted one. "Whatever you are thinking of building," she said, "you are not the first Callahan woman to think of it. You are the second." She squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "But you might be," she said, the first one to finish. Merrick did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed under the sloped ceiling of the upstairs bedroom, and she listened to Delphine's soft breathing in the bed across from her, and she stared at the plaster ceiling in the moonlight. And she thought about the drawing. She thought about the way her grandmother's hand had shaken when she unfolded it. She thought about a young woman in 1968, 27 years old, with a baby on her hip, standing in front of 4 men in a government office in Benton, Kentucky, holding out a piece of paper and being laughed at. Merrick had heard laughter like that. She had heard it that very morning on the porch of the little white farmhouse on the old sharp road from Buford Halsey and Ollis Trumbo, and the brother-in-law whose name she couldn't remember. She did not know, lying there in the dark, that the laughter had traveled 55 years to reach her. She only knew that she was going to build the thing her grandmother had drawn. She was going to build it before summer ended, and she was not going to let anyone laugh her out of it. The next morning, before the sun came up, Merrick took a shovel from the barn and walked out to the north pasture. The seasonal draw, the shallow depression at the top of the slope where rainwater pooled after storms, was dry. It had been dry for 3 weeks, but Merrick knew what it looked like when it was full. She had watched it fill in April and again in early May, and she had marked the high water line on a fence post with a nail. She stood at the edge of the draw in the gray light before dawn, and she measured. She had brought a length of clothesline with knots tied at 1 foot intervals. She stretched the line from the bottom of the draw to the top of the slope where her father's soybeans struggled. The elevation change was 9 feet. She had already measured it twice. She measured it again anyway. 9 feet of head pressure. It was enough. She stood there in the gray light for a long time, and she looked at the slope and she looked at the sky, the color of old brass, and she thought about her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with a 55-year-old drawing folded into her Bible, and she made a promise to herself in the silence. Then she went home to breakfast. Her father found out 4 days later. Silas Callahan came in from the barn at midday, looking for a length of PVC pipe he needed to fix the water line to the cattle trough. He knew there was a stack of scrap pipe behind the chicken coop. He had assumed without thinking about it much that it was left over from a repair he had made 2 years ago. But when he walked around behind the coop with a pair of work gloves and a pipe cutter, he stopped. The stack behind the coop was not the small pile of scrap he remembered. It was enormous. Sections of aluminum irrigation pipe sorted by diameter, coils of black polyethylene tubing, PVC fittings in a 5-gallon bucket, a roll of drip tape still wrapped in its plastic sleeve from the farm supply store, a neat pile of elbow joints, a stack of end caps. Silas stared at it. He did not touch anything. He walked back around to the front of the coop. He stood in the yard with his gloves in his hand. He looked at the chicken wire. He looked at the house. He looked for a long moment at nothing at all. Then he called his daughter's name. His voice was not loud. It was not angry. But there was something in it that had not been there before. Merrick came around the corner of the barn a moment later, her braids swinging, her boots dusty. She saw her father standing there with his gloves in his hand and his eyes fixed on her. And she knew. She stopped. She did not run. She walked up to her father, and she stood in front of him, and she looked up at him with her pond water eyes, and she waited. Silas said, "What are you doing, child?" Merrick did not answer. Silas said, "What is all that pipe for?" Merrick took a breath. She said quietly, "I'm going to build an irrigation system for the North Field." Silas did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "No, you are not." That was the first time Merrick had ever heard her father tell her no. He had told her 1,000 small no's in her life. No more cookies, no, you cannot ride the tractor by yourself. No, you cannot skip school even though it's raining. But he had never told her no like this, not with his voice going quiet the way it had, not with his eyes on hers the way they were. He said, "This is not a game, Merrick. This farm is in trouble. Do you understand me? If you break something, if you dig a trench in the wrong place, if you damage that field, I cannot afford to fix what you break. Do you understand?" Merrick did understand. She understood better than her father knew. She had read the bank letters. She had heard the kitchen conversations. She knew in a way an 11-year-old should not have to know exactly how thin the ice was. But she could not say that. She could only stand there, small and freckled, with her braid over her shoulder, and nod. Silas said, "You take that pipe back." Merrick's throat closed up. Silas said, "You take it back to whoever gave it to you, every last piece, and you find something else to do with your summer." He turned and walked back to the barn. He did not look at her again. Merrick stood in the yard for a long time after he was gone. She did not cry. She did not go back to the pipe. She walked very slowly up the back steps and into the kitchen. Her mother was there. Marlene Callahan was 39 years old. She had married Silas when she was 19 and he was 22, and in 20 years of marriage, she had learned every shade of her husband's silences, and she had learned when to speak and when not to. She was standing at the sink with her hands in a bowl of green beans, snapping them one by one, and she had heard everything from the open window. She dried her hands on a dish towel. She walked over to her daughter. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and she pulled out a small brass key. She placed it in Merrick's hand. She said, "is the key to the equipment shed behind the barn." Merrick looked up at her. Marlene's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Your father keeps things in there he does not use anymore. Old fittings, a stack of clamps, some pipe wrenches, things he has forgotten about." She closed her daughter's small fingers around the key. You will need them." Merrick could not speak. Marlene bent down. She kissed her daughter on the top of her head once, and she whispered into the parting of her hair. "I believe you," she said. "Your daddy is scared, child. Scared men say hard things, but being scared does not make him right. Do it anyway." Then she went back to the sink. She put her hands back into the bowl of green beans. She did not look at her daughter again. But Merrick stood there in the kitchen with the brass key in her hand, and she felt something in her chest that she had never felt before. It was not courage. It was permission. It was the second permission she had received in 3 days, first from a grandmother, with a 55-year-old drawing folded in a Bible, and now from a mother with a brass key in her apron. 2 women, 2 Callahan women, handing her the things she needed to keep going. That night at the downtown diner on Main Street in Benton, Buford, Halsey sat in his usual booth by the window with a cup of coffee and a slice of pecan pie, and he held court. Buford Halsey held court every Thursday night at the downtown diner. It was a habit he had developed over 30 years of being the richest farmer in Marshall County. He would sit in his booth, and men would come and sit with him, and they would talk about crops and weather and cattle prices, and Buford would tell stories, and the men would laugh at the stories, and the laughter would ripple out through the diner and be heard by everyone. On this particular Thursday night, Buford Halsey told the story of Silas Callahan's little girl. He told about seeing her on the old Sharp Road with a wagon full of scrap pipe. He told about how she had gone door to door for 4 Saturdays, asking farmers for their rusted junk. He told about how she was apparently, according to what he had heard from Delmer Prewitt, planning to build some kind of contraption in her daddy's north field. "Silas Callahan's little girl," he said, and he chuckled, and he took a long, slow sip of his coffee, "is going to save that farm with a pile of rusted pipe." The men at the table laughed. The men at the next table laughed. The waitress laughed. And in a booth in the back of the diner, hidden by the high back of a vinyl seat, Marlene Callahan sat with her daughter Merrick, who had come into town with her mother to pick up a prescription at the drugstore, and who was eating a small dish of vanilla ice cream, and who heard every word. Merrick set down her spoon. She looked up at her mother. Marlene had gone very still across the table. For a moment, Marlene's eyes moved toward the front of the diner, and her jaw tightened, and Merrick saw the flash of a woman about to stand up. But Marlene did not stand. She looked back at her daughter, at her small daughter, with the vanilla ice cream melting in front of her, and she made a different decision, a quieter one. She would not give Buford Halsey the satisfaction of a scene, and she would not put her 11-year-old in the middle of one. Marlene reached across the table, and she covered her daughter's small hand with her own, and she squeezed it once hard. She said very softly, "We are going to walk out of here now. Chin up. Do not let them see." Merrick nodded. They stood. They paid at the counter without looking at Buford's booth. They walked out to the truck. But Merrick had already seen the color drain out of her mother's face. And in the front of the diner, the laughter went on. It went on for a long time. Merrick Callahan, 11 years old, sat in the passenger seat of the pickup truck outside the downtown diner, and she felt the laughter roll over her like a wave, even after the door of the diner closed behind her. And for the first time since she had started collecting pipes, she felt something break inside her chest. She did not cry at the table. She waited until she was in the truck on the way home in the dark with her mother driving in silence beside her. Then she turned her face to the window, and she pressed her small forehead against the cold glass, and she cried without making a sound. Her mother saw. Her mother reached across the bench seat and put her hand on the back of her daughter's neck, and left it there all the way home, all 7 miles of dark country road, without saying a word. And in the north pasture under a moon the color of bone, the seasonal draw sat dry and waiting, 9 feet above a field of dying soybeans, holding a promise that had been waiting 55 years to be kept. Merrick Callahan began waking at 4:30 in the morning. The alarm clock on her nightstand was a small wind-up thing with a cracked plastic face, and she had learned to reach for it in the dark before it could ring, so it would not wake Delphine sleeping across the room. She would slide out from under her quilt in her socks dress in the closet with the door mostly closed. and carry her boots down the stairs in her hand so the floorboards would not betray her. The kitchen at 4:30 in the morning was a country of shadows. The stove clock glowed a dim green. The refrigerator hummed. Merrick would pour herself a glass of water from the tap, drink it standing at the sink, and slip out the back door into the yard, where the grass was cold and wet against her ankles, and the sky above the tree line was the color of a bruise beginning to heal. She had 3 hours before her father woke. 3 hours, 6 days a week to dig a trench 900 feet long by hand. She used a spade with a wooden handle that had belonged to her grandfather. The handle was smooth from decades of use, and it fit her small hands in a way that felt older than she was. She had marked the path of the trench with tent stakes and a length of white cotton string her mother had given her from the sewing basket. The string ran in a long, gentle curve from the seasonal draw at the top of the slope down through the north pasture to the edge of the soybean field. And Merrick followed the string the way a seamstress follows a seam. She dug 6 inches down. She lifted the sod carefully in squares, and she stacked the squares beside the trench with the grass side up so she could put them back afterward and no one would see. Her hands blistered on the first morning. They bled on the second. By the 4th morning, the blisters had opened and closed and opened again, and she had wrapped strips of an old pillowcase around her palms with electrical tape from the barn, and she kept digging. Delphine found her on the 5th morning. The little girl had woken up at 5:15, seen the empty bed across the room, and come downstairs in her nightgown and her rubber boots. She had walked out to the north pasture in the pale gray light, and she had stood at the top of the slope and watched her older sister for a long time before Merrick noticed her. Merrick straightened. She looked at Delphine. She did not know what to say. Delphine walked down the slope in her nightgown. She stopped at the edge of the trench. She looked at the string. She looked at the stacked squares of sod. She looked at her sister's wrapped hands. Then she sat down cross-legged in the wet grass. She said, "I want to help." Merrick opened her mouth. She meant to say no. She meant to say that Delphine was 8 years old and needed her sleep and needed to stay out of it. But she looked at her little sister sitting there in her nightgown, and she remembered the way Delphine had always followed her into the henhouse, into the barn, into the woods behind the pond. And she understood in that moment that saying no would mean something worse than yes. She handed Delphine a garden trowel from her back pocket. She said, "You dig at the tent stakes, just around them, so they stay straight." Delphine took the trowel with both hands. She got to work. By 6:30 that morning, when the eastern sky had gone the color of a peach, Merrick had extended the trench another 40 feet, and Delphine had cleared the soil around 11 tent stakes without disturbing a single one. They walked back to the house together. They took off their boots in the mudroom. They said nothing about it to anyone. They did the same thing the next morning, and the morning after that. The trench reached the top of the seasonal draw on the 12th morning of secret work. Merrick stood in the pale light and looked at what she had done, and she almost could not believe it. 900 feet of shallow trench cut clean following the gentle curve of the slope, disappearing down into the north pasture, where the soybean field waited. But a trench without pipe was just a scar in the ground. That afternoon, while her father was gone to the co-op in Benton for feed, Merrick used her mother's brass key to unlock the equipment shed behind the barn. She had never been inside it. It was a small building, no bigger than a 2-car garage with a tin roof and a single window gone opaque with dust. She pushed the door open and stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The shed smelled of oil and old rubber and mouse droppings. The walls were lined with pegboards, and the pegboards were hung with tools and fittings and coils of wire, and things Merrick did not recognize. There were stacks of 5-gallon buckets in the corner. There was a workbench under the window with a vise on one end. And along the back wall, on a set of homemade wooden shelves, were exactly the things her mother had told her would be there. Pipe fittings, clamps, 2 heavy wrenches with red-painted handles, a cardboard box full of brass hose bibs, a roll of Teflon tape unopened, and on the bottom shelf, half hidden behind a crate of nails, a length of galvanized pipe threading die that must have cost her father $100 15 years ago and had not been used since. Merrick stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at all of it. and she understood something she had not understood before. Her mother had known. Her mother had known for a long time. Her mother had been waiting. The next problem was harder than the trench. Merrick had to move the pipe from behind the chicken coop to the north pasture without her father seeing. The pipe was heavy, the sections were long, and her father worked the fields every day, and the north pasture was in his direct line of sight from the tractor barn. She solved it the way she solved everything else that summer. She waited. She waited for the Tuesday afternoon when her father drove into Paducah to meet with the loan officer at the bank. She waited for the day when Rennick was gone to basketball practice at the school gym in Benton. She waited for the day when her mother told her quietly that Silas would be gone from 10 in the morning until nearly 6 in the evening. She had 8 hours. She used all of them. She hitched the wooden trailer to her bicycle. She loaded 5 sections of pipe at a time. She rode across the pasture path 140 yards from the coop to the top of the slope, and she unloaded the pipe into the trench she had dug. Then she rode back. She loaded 5 more sections. She rode again. She made 22 trips. By 4 in the afternoon, her legs were shaking so hard she could barely stand. Her wrapped hands had bled through the electrical tape and were leaving faint red prints on the handlebars. Her shirt was soaked through with sweat. But the pipes were all in the trench, laid end to end, waiting to be joined. Delphine sat at the top of the slope the whole time and kept watch. The 2 Callahan girls, ages 11 and 8, worked in silence in the July heat, and no one on the farm knew what they were doing. When Silas came home at 6 that evening, he ate his supper without speaking, and he went out to the porch to sit alone in the swing, and he did not once look toward the north pasture, where 900 feet of pipe now lay in a trench under a thin covering of soil that his elder daughter had raked over the top with a garden rake to hide her work. The joining was the hardest part. Merrick had studied her grandmother's drawing until she knew every line by heart. She understood the theory. Water flowing downhill through a network of pipes needed to move from larger diameter at the top to smaller diameter at the emitter so pressure could equalize across the entire run. The transitions had to be sealed. The elbows had to be threaded. The fittings had to be tight. She had every fitting she needed. What she did not have was the strength in her small hands to torque a 2-inch coupling to the proper tightness against 50-year-old aluminum threads. She tried anyway. She worked in the trench for 3 mornings straight on her knees in the dirt, using her grandfather's wrench with both hands, throwing her whole small weight against the handle. She got most of the couplings tight. She got a few very tight. She got 2 that she could not budge past what she thought was probably good enough. On the 4th morning at first light, she opened the valve she had rigged at the top of the draw. Water came in from the seasonal catchment through a length of 2-inch aluminum. It ran down the slope through the main line. It reached the first junction. It reached the second. At the 3rd junction, it began to leak. At the 4th, it sprayed. At the 5th, a coupling blew off entirely with a sound like a firecracker, and a jet of water shot 6 feet into the air. And Merrick watched her 4 weeks of work turn into a fountain in the pasture. She stood in the trench in the mud, and she watched. She did not cry. She did not move. She just watched the water come out of the joint that had failed. And she calculated in the small quiet chamber of her mind how many hours it would take her to fix it. That was when Rennick found her. Merrick's older brother had woken up early because his basketball coach had scheduled a 5:30 a.m. conditioning run at the school track. He had come downstairs at 4:45 in his running shoes, and he had seen the back door standing open, and he had walked out into the yard to see what was going on. He followed the wet grass across the pasture. He came over the top of the slope, and he saw the trench, and he saw the water spraying, and he saw his little sister standing in the mud in her wrapped hands. Rennick was 14. He was tall for his age. He wore his hair short and his temper long. He was in most ways a normal 14-year-old boy, mostly interested in basketball, moderately interested in a girl in his history class, deeply uninterested in whatever his little sister happened to be doing at any given time. He stood at the top of the slope and looked at the trench. He looked at the pipe. He looked at his sister standing in the water. He said, "You've got to be kidding me." Merrick did not answer. Rennick's face went dark. He was thinking about the loan letters he had seen on the kitchen counter. He was thinking about his father's face at supper. He was thinking that his little sister was standing in a trench with a fountain of wasted water shooting 6 feet in the air, in a field they could not afford to lose in a summer. They could not afford to fail, and that nobody had told him anything about it. He said, "Does Dad know?" Merrick did not answer. Rennick's jaw tightened. He turned and walked back to the house. Merrick called after him. Her voice was thin and small in the morning air. "Rennick, please." He did not turn around. Silas Callahan walked out to the north pasture at 6:15 that morning, with his son behind him. He was still in his sleep clothes, a pair of work pants pulled on over long johns, a flannel shirt, buttoned-wrong boots without socks. His face was gray with fury. He stopped at the top of the slope. He looked at the trench. He looked at the pipe still spraying water from the failed coupling. He looked at his 11-year-old daughter standing in the mud. Then, without a word, he walked down into the trench and he grabbed the length of aluminum pipe closest to him with both hands and he ripped it out of the ground. Merrick made a sound. It was not a word. It was something smaller and worse. It came from a place in her chest that she had not known was there. Silas did not hear her. Or if he did not stop. He walked to the next section of pipe and he ripped that one out too. And the next. And the next. He worked his way down the trench, tearing out 4 weeks of secret labor. And Merrick stood in the mud and watched him do it, and she could not move. She heard footsteps on the slope above. Her grandmother was coming down. Etta Callahan, 82 years old in her house coat and her slippers, was walking down the wet slope toward the trench. And she was moving faster than Merrick had ever seen her move. She reached the edge of the trench. She said, "Silas." He did not stop. She said louder, "Silas Callahan." He stopped then. He turned to look at his mother. She was standing at the top of the trench with her white hair coming loose from its bun and her housecoat wet at the hem, and her pond water eyes were on him, and her small knotted hands were trembling at her sides. She said, "Look at what you are doing." Silas said, "Mama, stay out of this." Etta said, "I will not." She took a step down into the trench, her slipper filled with mud. She did not seem to notice. She said, "You are standing in the mud tearing out your daughter's work with your bare hands, and you cannot even see what you are doing." Silas said, "She was going to ruin the field." Etta said, "She was going to save it." Silas turned away from his mother. Etta said, "Look at me, Silas." He did not turn. Etta said, "Look at me, because I am going to say something to you that I have never said to anyone in this family, and I am going to say it once." Silas turned. Etta stood in the mud in her housecoat, and she looked at her son and she said, "You are doing to that child exactly what your father did to me 55 years ago in the extension office in Benton, in front of 4 men in neckties. You are doing the same thing, and I have watched it happen twice now in one lifetime, and I will not watch it a 3rd time." Silas Callahan stared at his mother. His hand, still holding a length of aluminum pipe, went slack. The pipe fell into the mud. He said, "What are you talking about?" Etta said, "Ask your daughter about the drawing in my Bible." She turned. She walked back up the slope in her muddy slippers, and she did not look back. Silas Callahan did not speak for a long time. He stood in the trench with the water still spraying from the failed coupling 10 feet behind him, and he looked at the pipes he had torn out lying in the mud like broken bones. And he looked at his daughter standing there in her wrapped and bleeding hands. And something in his face changed. He did not apologize. He was not the kind of man who could apologize with words. Not yet. He walked out of the trench. He walked up the slope. He walked past his son, who was still standing at the top with his arms crossed and his face uncertain. He walked into the barn. He was gone for a long time. Merrick stood in the mud. She did not move. The water kept spraying. After a while, Delphine came down the slope in her nightgown. She walked to her big sister, and she put her arms around Merrick's waist, and she pressed her face into Merrick's wet shirt, and she did not say anything at all. The man who came up the driveway that afternoon was 78 years old. He drove a 1994 Ford pickup the color of dust, And he pulled up in front of the house at 3 in the afternoon and sat in the truck for a full minute before he got out. When he did get out, he did so slowly like a man whose knees hurt, but who was too proud to let it show. He wore a straw hat and a pearl snap shirt and a pair of work boots that had seen 40 summers. His name was Wendell Boone. He had not set foot on the Callahan farm in 29 years since the funeral of Cyrus Callahan in the winter of 1994. He had lived his whole life 10 miles east of the Callahan place on a smaller farm he had inherited from his father and run alone until arthritis had forced him to sell off his cattle in 2011. He walked up to the front porch. He knocked on the door. Etta Callahan opened it. The two old people stood looking at each other for a long moment. Etta said, "Wendell." He took off his hat. He said, "Etta, I heard about your granddaughter." Etta did not move from the doorway. Wendell said, "May I speak with her?" Etta looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped aside and she called Merrick's name. Merrick came out onto the porch. She had washed her hands. She had changed her clothes. Her mother had put fresh bandages on her palms. She looked at the old man on the porch with her quiet green eyes, and she waited. Wendell Boone twisted his hat in his hands. He said, "Miss Callahan, my name is Wendell Boone. I was a friend of your grandfather's, and I knew your grandmother when she was a young woman." Merrick did not speak. Wendell said, "I heard from Delmer Pruitt at the co-op yesterday that you were building an irrigation system in your daddy's field. I heard you were building it from scrap pipe you collected yourself." He paused. "I heard about what happened this morning." Merrick still did not speak. Wendell looked down at his hat. He said, "Miss Callahan, I need to tell you something, and I do not know how to say it, so I'm going to just say it plain." He looked up at her. "In the fall of 1968, he said, your grandmother took a drawing to the extension office in Benton. I know because I was there. I was 23 years old. I had just come home from 2 years working construction in Louisville. I was sitting in the waiting room to ask about a soil test for my daddy's farm." He paused. "I saw your grandmother walk in. I saw her sit down at that table with 4 men and unfold her drawing. I heard every word they said to her. I heard them laugh. I heard them tell her a woman couldn't understand pipe pressure. I heard them tell her to go home." His voice went quieter, and I did not say a word. I sat in that waiting room and I watched a young woman with a baby on her hip get laughed out of that office. And I knew even then that she was smarter than every man at that table. I could see it in the drawing. I have thought about engineering my whole life. I knew what I was looking at. He turned his hat in his hands. "I said nothing," he said. "I was afraid of what those men would say about me if I spoke up for her. I was 23 years old and a coward, and I have thought about that afternoon every year of my life since." Merrick stared at him. Wendell said, "I have a barn full of pipe, good pipe, 2-inch and 3-inch aluminum, most of it, fittings, couplings, threading equipment. I bought it in 1982 for a system I was going to build on my own place, and I never built it. I could not bring myself to. It has sat in my barn for 41 years. He looked at her. "I would like to give it to you, all of it, today if you will accept it." The porch was very quiet. From the kitchen came the sound of Etta Callahan setting down a coffee cup on the oak table very carefully. Merrick looked at the old man in the pearl snap shirt. She said quietly, "Why?" Wendell Boone's eyes filled with water. He said, "Because I have owed your grandmother an apology for 55 years, and I do not know how to give it to her directly, but I can give it to you." Merrick was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." Wendell nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, "I will bring the first load tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. He turned to go down the porch steps. At the bottom step, he stopped and he looked back at the door, where Etta Callahan stood watching him from the shadow of the hallway. He said, "Etta, I am sorry." Etta did not answer, but she nodded once, and Wendell Boone got in his 1994 Ford pickup and drove away down the gravel road. That night, a letter arrived from the bank in Paducah in the day's late mail. Silas Callahan read it standing at the kitchen counter. He read it twice. He set it down on the counter. He walked out onto the porch. He sat in the swing for a long time in the dark. Marlene came out at 10 o'clock and sat beside him. He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it. She folded it carefully and set it in her lap. They sat together on the porch swing in the summer dark, and the crickets sang in the yard, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Silas said, 60 days. Marlene said, I know. Silas said, if the crop fails, we lose the North 40, maybe more. Marlene said, I know that too. Silas was silent for a long time. Then he said, I tore out her work this morning. Marlene did not answer. Silas said, I stood in the mud and I tore out my daughter's work with my hands. My mother came down the slope in her housecoat and told me I was doing to Merrick what her daddy did to her. Marlene said you were. Silas put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a long time. When he lifted his head, his eyes were wet. He said, Marlene, what do I do? Marlene reached across the swing and took her husband's hand. She said, you go up those stairs, Silas Callahan. You knock on your daughter's door, and you tell her you were wrong. Silas walked up the stairs at 10:45 that night. The house was quiet. The floorboards creaked under his boots. He stopped outside the bedroom door where his two daughters slept, and he stood there for a full minute before he raised his hand and knocked once very softly. Merrick opened the door. She was still awake. She was in her nightgown and her hair was down and her hands were freshly bandaged with clean white gauze her mother had wrapped after supper. Silas looked down at his daughter. His throat worked. He said, Merrick, I was wrong. She looked up at him. He said, I was wrong this morning. I was wrong before that. I have been wrong all summer. Merrick did not speak. He said, I would like to help you build it, if you will let me. Starting tomorrow, before sunup, I will dig with you. I will haul pipe with you. I will do whatever you tell me to do. Merrick's eyes filled. She did not say anything. She just stepped forward and she put her small arms around her father's waist, and she pressed her face into his flannel shirt. Silas Callahan stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom at 10:45 on a hot July night in Marshall County, Kentucky, and he held his 11-year-old daughter. And he understood finally what his mother had meant that morning in the mud. Outside, the seasonal draw at the top of the slope sat dry under the stars. The pipes lay scattered in the trench where he had torn them. But in the barn behind the equipment shed on a workbench under a single yellow bulb, 3 generations of Callahans would gather before dawn. A grandmother with a 55-year-old drawing in her Bible, a mother with a brass key in her apron, and a father with dirt still under his fingernails from the ruin he had made that morning. And an 11-year-old girl with bandaged hands would show them what she had drawn on the back of a paper feed sack. And they would begin again. They began before the sun came up. At 4:45 on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of July, 5 figures moved across the north pasture of the Callahan farm in the pale gray light. Merrick walked at the front with her paper feed sack folded under her arm, the drawing on the back of it done in pencil the night before by candlelight at the kitchen table. Behind her came her father in his work clothes with his grandfather's shovel over his shoulder. Behind him came Rennick, silent, uncertain, carrying a bucket of couplings in each hand. Behind him came her mother Marlene in denim and boots, with a canvas bag full of Teflon tape and pipe wrenches. And at the back, moving slowly but not stopping, came Etta Callahan in her old work coat and a pair of rubber boots she had not put on in 29 years, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee for the workers. They reached the top of the slope as the eastern sky began to pale. Silas stopped at the edge of the trench. He looked at what he had torn out the morning before. He did not speak. He set down his shovel. He walked to the first section of pipe he had ripped from the ground, and he picked it up in his hands, and he carried it back to where it had been, and he laid it down in the trench gently, the way a man lays down a thing he had no right to lift. Merrick watched him. Then she walked to the head of the trench, and she opened her feed sack, and she smoothed the drawing flat against a fence post, and she began to explain. She spoke quietly. Her voice was small but steady. She showed her father where the collector needed to widen. She showed him where the transitions had to step down. She showed him where the 2 failed couplings had been, and why they had failed and what she thought would fix them. Silas listened. He asked questions. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he nodded once and he picked up his shovel and he went to work. Wendell Boone arrived at 6:15 in his 1994 Ford pickup with the first load of pipe. He backed the truck up to the fence line at the top of the pasture. He climbed down slow and stiff, and he opened the tailgate and he began to hand down 2-inch aluminum pipe to Rennick, who ran it down the slope to Silas one section at a time. Wendell had brought a set of pipe threaders. He had brought a can of pipe dope. He had brought a fitting he called a pressure balancer, which he said he had bought in 1982 and never installed, and which was the exact thing Merrick's drawing needed at the second junction. He said the pressure balancer in Merrick's small bandage hand. He said, "I have been carrying this for 41 years without knowing why." Merrick closed her fingers around it. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Boone." Wendell touched the brim of his hat. He said, "Miss Callahan, it is I who thank you." They worked for 11 days. The bank had given Silas 60. 22 had already passed. 38 remained. And the soybean field at the bottom of the slope was beginning to yellow at the edges of the rows. Every morning at 4:45, the 5 of them assembled in the yard. Every night at 9, they came in from the field so filthy that Marlene had begun leaving buckets of soapy water on the back porch, so no one tracked mud through the house. Rennick had stopped going to basketball practice. His coach had called on the 3rd day. Rennick had told him without apology that he was needed at home. His coach had said, "Son, this could cost you your starting spot." Rennick had said, "I know." He had hung up the phone. He had not spoken of it again. By the 5th day, Delphine was in the trench too, carrying small tools between the workers filling water bottles at the pump, keeping track of the fittings in a wooden crate she had labeled in careful 8-year-old handwriting. 2-inch, 1-inch, half-inch, elbows, T's. By the 7th day, they had laid 1,200 feet of pipe. By the 9th, they had joined every coupling, threaded every transition set, every emitter. On the 10th day in the late afternoon, Silas Callahan walked to the top of the slope and opened the intake valve at the seasonal draw. Water flowed. It flowed down through the 2-inch main. It reached the first junction. It held. It reached the second. It held. It reached Wendell's pressure balancer, and it stepped down to the 1-inch lateral, and it held. It reached the half-inch drip line at the head of the soybean field, and the emitters began to weep one after the other. Slow, steady beads of water dropping straight down onto the parched soil. No leaks, no sprays, no blown couplings, just water moving downhill through 50-year-old aluminum and 41-year-old fittings. And the sum of 3 generations of Callahan patience arriving at last at the roots of a crop that had been dying 2 weeks before. The family stood at the edge of the field and watched. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. Silas took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He looked at the water. He looked at his daughter. And then he did something he had not done in the presence of his family in 20 years. He wept. Merrick stood beside him. She reached up with her small bandaged hand and she took her father's rough hand in hers, and she held it. Etta Callahan, at the back of the little group, set her thermos down in the grass and did not pick it up again for a long time. The storm came on the 11th night. It rolled in from the west at 9 o'clock in the evening, a summer thunderstorm of the kind that formed fast and dropped hard. The wind picked up, the sky flashed. The rain came sideways in sheets, and by 10 o'clock the yard was running like a creek. And by midnight the pasture was a churning brown lake. And Silas stood at the window in the kitchen, with his hand on the sill, and watched water sluice off the north slope, and knew what he would find in the morning. The storm passed by 3 a.m. At first light, the family walked out to the pasture together. The trench was gone, not everywhere, but in 3 long stretches where the slope was steepest, where the runoff had cut hardest. The storm had washed out the shallow soil covering the pipes, and had shoved the pipes themselves sideways, and had split 2 of the fittings clean apart with the sheer force of moving water. 98 feet of pipe lay exposed and twisted in a red clay ravine that had not been there the day before. Merrick stood at the edge of it in her boots. She looked at the ruin. She did not cry. She had grown past crying that summer. She had cried in the truck. She had cried in the mud. She had cried into her father's shirt at 10:45 on the night he came to her door. She had done all the crying she could do. What was left in her at 11 years old was something quieter and older than tears. She turned to her family. She said, "We start again." Silas nodded. Rennick, standing beside him in a wet jacket, said, "How long do we have?" Silas said, 8 days until the loan officer comes. Rennick said, "Then we better get moving." He walked down into the ravine and he began to lift the twisted pipe with his bare hands. They did not sleep that week. They ate meals standing in the field. Marlene brought sandwiches and pitchers of water and cold sweet tea, and they ate leaning against the fence posts and went back to work with the food still in their mouths. Etta sat in a folding chair at the top of the slope and read pamphlets out loud when they asked her to. She read from a 1971 University of Kentucky bulletin about anchoring irrigation lines against erosion. She read from a 1963 extension pamphlet about French drains and rock aprons. Merrick took notes on the back of the same feed sack she had drawn her original design on adding and revising. And by the third day of the rebuild, they had a new plan that would hold against any storm the summer could throw at them. Wendell Boone came every morning at 6 with more supplies. On the 5th day, he brought his neighbor, an 80-year-old woman named Ida Bashir, who had been a school teacher in Marshall County for 40 years, and who had heard through the grapevine of small-town Kentucky what was happening on the Callahan farm. Ida Bashir did not offer to work in the trench. She was too old for that. But she brought a cast-iron pot of chicken and dumplings, and she set it on the tailgate of Wendell's truck. And she said to Etta Callahan, "You feed those children, Etta. That is my part." Etta looked at her old friend and said, "Ida, do you remember 1968? Ida said, "I remember, Etta." Etta said, "I am too old to be surprised, but I am not too old to be grateful." Ida squeezed her hand. She went home. She came back the next day with another pot. She came back every day after that for a week. The loan officer from the Paducah Bank was a man named Mr. Trenholm, and he arrived at the Callahan farm at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, exactly 60 days after the third letter had been sent. He was a thin man in a gray suit with a manila folder under his arm. He shook Silas's hand at the front porch. He said, "Mr. Callahan, shall we walk the fields?" Silas said, "Yes, sir." They walked the fields together. Mr. Trenholm walked the South 41st and then the middle ground, and both of them had the same dry-curled, yellowed look as every other field in Marshall County. Mr. Trenholm made notes on a small pad. He shook his head. He said nothing. Then Silas led him up to the north field. Mr. Trenholm stopped at the top of the slope. He stared. 12 acres of soybeans, dense and deeply green, stretched out below him in perfect rows. The canopy was so full it hid the soil. The plants stood straight and heavy with pods, not a single yellow leaf as far as the eye could see. The neighboring fields across the fence line on both sides were the color of old paper. Mr. Trenholm walked slowly down between the rows. He bent, he pulled a pod, he split it with his thumbnail. The bean inside was plump and green and perfectly formed. He straightened. He looked at Silas. He said, "Mr. Callahan, what have you done here?" Silas turned. He looked at the top of the slope where his 11-year-old daughter stood next to her grandmother in the shade of the fence post. He said, "That is my daughter's work, sir, not mine." Mr. Trenholm looked up the slope. He looked at the small figure of Merrick Callahan in overalls and a braid with bandaged hands hanging at her sides. He looked back at Silas. He said, "Sir, I would like her to explain it to me." Merrick walked Mr. Trenholm through the entire system for 45 minutes. She started at the seasonal draw. She showed him the intake. She walked him down the main line junction by junction, explaining the pressure math in the small, clear voice of a child who had learned every number the hard way. She showed him Wendell's pressure balancer. She showed him the erosion anchors they had installed after the storm. She showed him the drip emitters, and she calculated for him from memory that the system delivered water at approximately 40% of the volume used by conventional overhead irrigation for the same acreage. Mr. Trenholm did not interrupt. He took notes. When she was done, he stood at the head of the field for a long moment looking down the rows. Then he said, "Miss Callahan, may I ask you a question?" Merrick nodded. He said, "Where did you learn all of this?" Merrick looked up the slope at her grandmother. She said, "My grandmother designed it. In 1968, I just built it." Mr. Trenholm followed her gaze to the top of the slope, where Etta Callahan stood with her white hair pulled back and her small hands folded at her waist. He did not speak for a moment. Then he turned back to Silas. He said, "Mr. Callahan, I came out here today prepared to begin foreclosure proceedings on your North 40. Silas said, "Yes, sir, I know." Mr. Trenholm said, "I am not going to do that." Silas went very still. Mr. Trenholm said, "The yield on this field alone at current market prices will exceed your interest payment. If the rest of your fields come in even at 50%, you will be current by October. I am going to recommend to the bank that we extend your terms by 90 days and revisit in the fall." He closed his notebook. He looked at Merrick. He said, "Miss Callahan, you have saved your family's farm." Merrick did not answer. She could not. The word traveled the way word always travels in a small county. It traveled through Ida Bashir at the Wednesday Quilt Circle at the First Baptist Church of Benton. It traveled through Wendell Boone at the Tuesday morning coffee at the Co-op. It traveled through Mr. Trenholm, who told his wife, who told her sister, who was married to a man who farmed 600 acres east of Paducah. It traveled through the checkout line at the Piggly Wiggly and the counter at the hardware store and the pew at the funeral of an old man named Delbert Hensley in the second week of August. By the last Saturday of August, farmers had begun to drive out to the Callahan farm. They came in ones and twos. They pulled up the gravel road in their pickups and they parked at the fence line and they walked up to the north field and they stood at the edge of the rows and looked. The soybeans were the deepest green anyone in Marshall County had ever seen. The neighboring fields across the fence were still the color of old paper. The men took off their caps. They walked between the rows. They pulled pods and split them. They asked questions. Merrick answered every question. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She stood in her overalls with her braid over her shoulder, and she explained the system junction by junction to men 3 and 4 and 5 times her age, who listened without interrupting and who did not laugh. Not one of them, not once. On the last day of August, a large black pickup truck pulled up the gravel road. Buford Halsey climbed out. He was alone. He held his cap in his hands. He walked up to the front porch of the Callahan house and he knocked on the door. Silas answered. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Buford said, "Silas." Silas said, "Buford." Buford said, "I would like to speak with your daughter and your mother, if they will see me." Silas said, "Wait here." He closed the door. He went and got them both. Merrick and Etta came out onto the porch together. They stood side by side. The girl in her overalls, the old woman in her cotton dress. 2 generations of Callahan women separated by 7 decades and joined by a piece of pipe that had waited 55 years to move water. Buford Halsey turned his cap in his hands. He looked at Merrick first. He said, "Miss Callahan, I told a story about you in the downtown diner in Benton the first week of July. I told it loud. I told it more than once. I made a joke of you and I made a joke of your work. And I got a room full of grown men to laugh at an 11-year-old girl." He paused. He said, "I was wrong. I was more than wrong. I was cruel. And I am here to tell you I am sorry." Merrick looked up at him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Buford turned to Etta. He took a long breath. He said, "Mrs. Callahan, my father was one of the 4 men in the extension office in September of 1968. Etta went very still. Buford said, "I was 14 years old that fall. I remember him coming home that evening. I remember him telling the story at the supper table. I remember him laughing. I remember the way my mother did not laugh and did not say anything and looked down at her plate." His voice thickened. He said, "I have thought about that supper often in the last few weeks, since I heard about what your granddaughter has done, since I understood finally what my father had done 55 years ago." He looked at her. He said, Mrs. Callahan, my father was wrong. The whole town was wrong. I was wrong 3 weeks ago in the diner. And on behalf of my father, who cannot apologize because he has been dead for 18 years, and on behalf of myself, who can I am asking your forgiveness. The porch was silent. Etta Callahan stood in her cotton dress with her hands folded at her waist, and her pond water eyes were on the man in front of her. And for the first time in 55 years, a tear moved down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She said quietly, "Buford, your father was a proud man. You are a better one." She reached out and she took Buford Halsey's hand in her small knotted one. She said, "I forgive you, and I forgive him. It has been long enough." Buford Halsey, 64 years old, put his other hand over hers, and he bent his head and he could not speak. The autumn came to Marshall County in the last week of September. The soybeans in the Callahan North Field were harvested on the 12th of October. The yield exceeded every expectation. The check from the elevator when it arrived was enough to bring Silas current with the bank and to leave a margin for winter feed and next spring seed. He drove into Paducah alone on a Tuesday to deliver the payment in person. Mr. Trenholm walked him to the door of the bank and shook his hand and said, "Give my regards to your daughter." Silas said, "I will." He did. That evening at supper, he set his fork down and looked across the table at Merrick. And he said in front of his whole family, "Merrick Callahan, you saved this farm, and your father would like to say thank you." Merrick, 11, going on 12, flushed the color of her overalls and looked down at her plate. Delphine reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. Rennet across the table said, "I would like to say thank you to you." Merrick could not lift her eyes, but she nodded. By November, 3 farms in Marshall County had asked
When I
Merrick
was
to help
young,
them
I
design
chased the
gravity-fed
horizon.
systems for their
Certain
young
peace was
One of them
waiting
was
there.
Buford Halsey.
I thought the
He
storms
offered to
were
pay
wrong
her
turns
something.
taken, and
Merrick
every
refused.
burden
She
was
said she would
unfair.
help him for free.
So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the
By
struggle
December, Wendell
was the
Boone had
thing
begun
that
bringing his
made
workshop
me
to the
grow.
Callahan barn on
The
Saturday
eagle
mornings,
learns
teaching
within
Merrick
the
and
wind,
Wendell
the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul
He was
that's
78
worth
years old.
becoming must walk where harder
He had
paths
never
may
been.
go.
By January, Etta Callahan
Was
had opened her
never
Bible
meant to be.
and removed the 55-year-old
The
drawing
storm
and
was
had smoothed it
never
flat on the
meant to
kitchen table
pass.
and
The
had signed
waves
it
were
in a
not
small
there to
press
stop
at
me.
the bottom.
They were
E.M.
there to
Callahan,
teach me how to
1960.
last.
Then below
Every
her
trial is
signature, she
part
had
of
written
the
in a
journey.
trembled in her
Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain
She
is
had
the
framed it.
reason for
She had
the
hung it.
climb.
It hung there beside the stove for every meal she cooked, every family gathering. For 3 generations of Callahan had stood in front of the
I've known loss that left me broken.
On a Sunday afternoon in the
I've known
last week of
fear that stole my breath. I've
the
known
sky was
nights so cold and
and the winter
endless.
wind
I
was
could
up in the
barely
lower.
take one
3
step.
generations of
Yet every wound became a teacher.
Etta
Every
walked.
failure left a
Merrick walked
mark,
the same.
and every valley that I
Delphine walked
walked
the
through
river.
placed
Gathering
another
the sea.
star within the dark.
Marlene
The
walked
river
with me.
doesn't fight the
They stopped at the top of the
learns to
slope.
calm
The trench was
its
invisible
way
now,
ahead.
the
What
cover of
seems
glass
a wall to those who
The
fear
seasonal
it
draw was full
becomes
again,
a path for those who
and a
try.
thin skim of ice covered the
The road was never meant to
Down the
be.
slope, the soybean field was a
The
stubble of
storm was
ground.
never meant to
Etta reached
pass.
into the
The waves were not
She took
there
out
to
a small
stop me.
folded
They were
She handed
there
it
to
to
teach me
Merrick
how
opened
to
it.
last.
Inside
Every
was a
trial is
single
part of the journey.
Merrick saw the
Every
last
scar
page of the small
becomes a guide. The
It was in
mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb.
Merrick read it silently. It was 6 lines long.
For the climb. One day I stopped asking why me and started
who had the
asking
reason
what can I learn. The moment
Etta said
I
quietly,
embraced the
I
fire,
wrote
the fire lost
She closed
mystical
Merrick's
and
small hand
destination
around. She said, "It was for you,
would
child.
never
The whole
separate
time,
all
it was
this
for you."
time.
Merrick looked up at her
The
grandmother.
road
Her
was
eyes
never
filled.
meant to
She
be
did not speak.
easy.
She did not mean
The
to.
storm
Etta
was
Callahan,
never
82
meant
years
to
old,
end.
took her
The battles were not sent to break
looked out
me.
over the north,
They were sent to
where a drawing
shape
had
the
finally
man
been built
I
50
am.
miles.
Every trial is part of the journey.
She said,
Every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason I can
Merrick pressed her
rise.
face into behind them.
So when the thunder finds me again,
Delphine ran back through the driveway.
and dark
The wind
clouds
moved across
gather
the
in the sky, I'll greet them like old companions,
soybean field
because
waited
they
on a kitchen wall in a
belong
two-story white farmhouse
to
300
the
yards away.
journey to
A framed drawing on yellowed notebook paper hung in the winter sunlight, signed by 200 across 2 centuries and finished at last.